Hello, everyone. Um, Paul Tomascak here. I'm joined by Kristin Sotak, the Associate Dean of the College of Business and Entrepreneurship, and perhaps there will be other Associate Deans showing up. Who knows? We wanted to get people together a couple times during the break so as to talk about the reporting process for intellectual integrity violations. We had been using Maxient, which is a system that is used by student affairs for a lot of res life and housing and student conduct related things. For a number of reasons, we've decided that Starfish is a better option. And so Starfish is what we're using now. The ultimate choice of this was based mainly on trying to make sure that the process of reporting is as easy as possible for faculty. We want people to report. We want people to hold students accountable for things. We want to have record of any sorts of violations, because it may be that a student does something that you see, that you think is relatively minor in your class. By entering that violation report, regardless of what the penalty is, including zero penalty, by putting that violation report in, it allows us to, on a later day, determine whether that student is a repeat offender or not. And so it may be that there was something minor in your class, but if there's also something minor in John's class and something minor in my class, these are things that if people aren't reporting, we don't know about. But if they are reporting, we have a system where we can catch repeat offenders. So Starfish is what we use because it's familiar, or at least it's becoming more familiar for faculty to use. The policy, intellectual integrity policy itself, was updated last spring. It is now law of the land in the undergraduate catalog. And so the policy is there for you to look at. The important thing is, when you have a violation that you've determined has happened, it doesn't take extra steps in Starfish. If you go into Starfish during the course of the semester in which you have the course, you can raise the flag in Starfish, and when you go to the Raise the Flag button at the top of Starfish, the first option that you get is Academic Integrity Flag. So it's right there in plain view. It gives you very little in terms of direction. There's basically a box that you can fill in. Unlike Maxient, which was really rather prescriptive in terms of, we want this, and we want the student number, and we want where the student lives, and all of this thing, stuff that really isn't important. Starfish will connect this with the student, so you don't need to do anything about typing in student numbers or anything else. All of that information is embedded. So the hope is that you will include a small number of things with your report. One is a incredibly brief, hopefully, description of the incident. We're talking a couple of sentences. We would like to see something about what the nature of the assignment was. Are we talking on the final exam of the course, or a discussion post? Major, minor, whatever. We would like to see whether you have had the conversation with the student and whether they have acknowledged any level of responsibility. Not that this necessarily changes anything, but from our standpoint, when it comes to appeals or anything else, it's good to see what the nature of conversation has been with the student, and in particular, whether the student has acknowledged anything. The consequence, if you have at that point determined that the student will fail the class because the syllabus says that they'll fail the class, or that you've decided that there will be no penalty because this was an incredibly minor assignment and you believe that the student has corrected the behavior. Just an idea of what the nature of the consequence is, and indicate whether you've discussed this incident with your associate dean. Not the most essential thing. If you are confident in having done academic integrity reporting over some period of time, you don't have to do this every single incident. If you are new to this, we certainly advise that you talk to your department chair before acting. Department chairs have a wealth of knowledge on these topics, so they're a good resource to go to in talking through how to talk to a student about this, talking through what sort of penalty should be applied, all of those sorts of things. We, the associate deans, are certainly happy to talk with anyone about any of these things at any time, but we don't want this to, talking with us, to be an impediment to your getting things done. So, and then you press save and it's in there. These are not seen by the student. These are seen by all of the academic associate deans. So if a student is flagged for something in the College of Business, I see it, which is important because students take classes in all different areas, so it's good to know what who's doing what where. Sometimes the associate deans will see one of these and we'll have a conversation amongst ourselves about, hey, did you see that flag? This is a student who's previously done something. What should we do about this? And this is stuff that you as the instructor in the one course don't have to worry about. That's one of the other upsides of this reporting mechanism is you're responsible for what goes on in your class and not feeling that you have to do anything more beyond that. Naturally, if you have larger concerns, we're happy to talk about it, but you shouldn't feel the responsibility of the world to have to police everything. If a student has done things in other classes, we will be aware of it and we will do what is necessary going forward to try to correct the behavior. So, in approximately 8 minutes, I told you what we wanted to say. So, what questions do you have? What concerns do you have?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Michael.
For number 6, after the starfish flag is raised, you can add additional comments about the incident. Does that include also additional comments about the student's behavior since the incident, or should that be handled under the other starfish flags for progress and academic, progression or performance in the course?
Yeah, adding material is something that if it pertains to the original incident, the cheating or the plagiarism or the whatever, then it's appropriate to include that in there. If it doesn't directly relate to it or maybe only tangentially relates to it, then I would think that other flags might be more useful. Again, most of the other, the academic flags are things that the students will see. So if you're part of this is whether you're trying to send the student a message versus whether you're trying to just do accounting of reporting of the incident. So,
Okay, does that also include when a student is caught multiple times in a semester, engaging in academic dishonesty activities.
In the case of the student who cheats on the first exam and then they cheat on the third exam, I would put those in as two separate reports. And it's unless they've failed the course by virtue of the cheating on the first exam, so the second really is not necessarily interesting or important. I think that reporting individual incidents as individual flags is a good practice. It's for the second flag to be able to say, we sat down after the first flag and I told the student in no uncertain terms that this is, these are the behaviors that you can't repeat. The student acknowledged that and said that they wouldn't. And, so I had decided on a light penalty to begin with, but having had that conversation and having had the student not comply, now I've decided to move to failing grade in the course. So. What else is there?
Hi, Paul. I have a question.
Sure.
I teach a writing intensive course, and if I suspect a student used AI when I explicitly tell them not to, even just for, say, the outline that they're supposed to create based on their research, is that something that I should be reporting if I suspect they used AI or if I really think they did? Like, what is that threshold for reporting that sort of thing?
Yeah, this is the world in which we now live, and it's one of the less. I mean, none of this is enjoyable when it comes to it, but it's one of the dicier parts of it because sometimes it's just you don't have the proof of it. In the old world of plagiarism, you could say this was copied and pasted from this, no question, done. In the new world, it's a little bit more, well, I don't see how a student could have done this, or I don't see how this student could have done this thing, because in the body of work that I've seen up to this point, they haven't been able to compose a complete sentence, and now here are 5 complete sentences in mint condition. Mm-hmm. I think that the way forward that I use is talking to the student foremost, and especially and it sounds like you have a nicely scaffolded assignment, if it's an early stage of the process, you can have a conversation that doesn't have a lot of, the weight of the world is crushing down upon you. It's a conversation of you being concerned that the student is doing something that is not only illegal in the course, but that isn't getting them to the learning goals that you want. If they're putting together an outline and they're just telling ChatGPT to give me an outline of this, then that robs them of the opportunity of figuring out what an outline should look like and how I can structure it. Mm-hmm. I think having the conversation with them that at this point this doesn't merit a huge penalty, but this is the kind of thing that isn't kosher going forward, puts the student on a little bit of caution that, okay, I've got to change my behaviors, but also gives them the idea that you're in it for their learning rather than you're in it for policing things. And I think that the more that we can separate the instructor as a police person versus the instructor as a learning colleague, the less inclined students are to engage in those behaviors, and the more likely it is that you're going to get some buy-in for, this is what she actually is saying is true. She wants me to learn this, so I'm not going to take the easy route with ChatGPT. I'm going to do things on the up and up. But there is no acid test for this. This is something that I think we can put ourselves in a better position by the structure of our classes, the structure of our assignments, the structure of our communications. But in the end, if there's a student who has decided from day one that I'm just cheating my way through this, if they're a clever cheat, then it's going to be really hard to do anything about it unless the assignment is set up in such a way as to be able to catch them, which again, you want to spend your time helping students learn, not trying to find clever ways of catching them cheating. And so I wish that I had a better answer for that. I think in most of the cases that the associate deans see, when a faculty member has an honest conversation with a student, particularly in an early scaffolded portion of a bigger assignment, there's a greater tendency to get honest feedback from students and accountability. If it's, everything is leading up to this, the entire grade hangs on this, then the likelihood of a student making a bad choice is greater, and the likelihood of a student not admitting that they've made the bad choice is greater.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
I appreciate that Rosie has been giving us excellent views of the central New York sky.
I'm so sorry. I got out of the...
I'm serious. It's
I am
very
so
nice.
very, very sorry.
It's been
That's
nice to see.
It's nice to see you, Paul. Actually, while we're on the topic of AI, do you mind if I ask just a quick question? And this is just because I've been out. For in our syllabi for an AI statement, is there some sort of language that's preferred when it pertains to plagiarism and understanding AI as not necessarily as just not creating original work?
Yeah. I think that the provost previously had put out recommendations for language that you can use in syllabi, and I'm not sure if that's something that I have an easy link to. I'm not immediately finding that. I can look into that and send something after the fact, but I think especially in the field that you're in, Rosie, you've got to be able to make the case from the start that original work is the key to being successful in any of those classes, whether it be English or creative writing, that you're doing things that are completely compromised by allowing AI to go beyond the point of just making sentences pretty. Having an intellectual component farmed out to AI is something that isn't getting students to the learning goal in the class and ultimately the learning goal in the major. So trying to have that conversation in a way that that's authentic and that demonstrates that, again, you're not trying to police things, that you're trying to help students be better writers and better thinkers, is ultimately the place where you want to be. But it's not easy, because it is so easy for students to just farm those things out and to be self-deceptive when it comes to, well, I wrote this. Well, okay, you wrote some of it, but realistically, most of what you wrote was delivered by ChatGPT, and you did a little tinkering of it. I think trying to get students to understand that AI tools can be useful in various ways, and here are some ways where you might find them useful, but here are ways where I consider it to be over the line. and here's why I consider it to be over the line. I think that's the best starting point that we can hope for with these sorts of things. Just saying that AI isn't legal to use in this class and not having any discussion about it, but just having that as the syllabus statement. And if you're, these are ideas that came up in both of the reading groups this past fall. If you're not putting any more time into that discussion, it is communicating to students that you really don't care about the topic, and from their standpoint, it's sort of a invitation to use those tools, and it's strangely contrary to exactly what you're trying to accomplish, but it ends up being something that communicates that you don't really care about the learning. It's the hoops that students are jumping through that's important, and we're just going to go through these hoops for 15 weeks and it's going to be all over at the end and we're going to move along, rather than this is important stuff. I want you to really internalize this so that you can take it into your professional life. And to back that up, here's what I'm willing to do as instructor to make sure that you get better at these things. But it does require the students to buy into that.
On the third condition on consulting with the students privately, preferably in person, is there a certain demeanor, certain language that we should try to make sure that we stick with when it comes to speaking with the students in person? Like, should we be stern? Should we, be sort of, try to be gentle? Is there a certain like method of that I think is, better for the student, better for us, or anything like that?
Um, I think that it's important to express your real concern, and I think the sternness aspect of it is, to some extent, that's going to be a personal thing, but I think letting a student know up front that this is why I'm talking to you, this is why it's important to me, what do you think about it? If it's I've caught you cheating, you had the notes written on your hand, there's not a lot of conversation to be had there. I mean, perhaps there is some conversation, but it's not a conversation about did you do something wrong. It's a conversation about you did something wrong. Let's talk about the implications of it. With using AI, the ground is a lot squishier, and it's really more about expressing your concerns about things and why you're concerned about it. And it's not just about the grade, and it's not just about the mechanics of the class, but really the importance of a student being able to do whatever the task is. If it's Math 102, it's importance of students being able to deal with multiplying fractions. If it's Calc 2, it's the value of students being able to evaluate partial integrals or whatever. The fact that these skills have value and practicing them legitimately has value beyond just a grade in a course. I think starting conversations that way, regardless of what your affect is, puts you in the best position of having a productive conversation. And really, you want to set things up so the conversation can be productive rather than just scolding or rather than just weaseling from the part of the student. Anything else?
Okay, I'll stop the recording.
Thanks, everybody. I hope that this